My name is Evelyn Bryant. I'm 68 years old, a former financial consultant from San Antonio. All my life, I took pride in one thing: managing my own money and making my own decisions. But one day, my own children told me I was too old to handle my finances. They said they wanted to take control for my own good. They spoke with soft voices, careful words, rehearsed concern. I stayed silent. I smiled. And then, quietly, without warning, I hired an attorney and a private investigator. What we uncovered was far worse than anything I could have imagined. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Evelyn Bryant, and when everything began, I was 68 years old. I had retired 5 years earlier after a long, satisfying career as a financial consultant in San Antonio. Numbers had always made sense to me when people didn't: budgets, investments, retirement plans. I built my life on logic and order. When the time came to step away from my career, I thought I might miss the rhythm of spreadsheets and client meetings, but I didn't. I welcomed the stillness. I lived alone by choice in a single-story brick house on the quieter side of town, not far from a small, glistening lake where the ducks gathered in the early mornings. My days moved at a gentler pace now. I would rise with the sun, brew a pot of strong black coffee, and sit by the window, watching the mist lift off the water. Sometimes I would read the newspaper front to back, not because the world's news demanded my attention, but because old habits offered comfort. The house itself was modest but warm. Worn oak floors, heavy blue drapes, a patchwork quilt draped over the couch that my late mother had sewn decades ago. My garden was my pride, a neat square of roses, lavender, and tomato plants that I tended like old friends. I had no pets, no loud neighbors, and no pressing demands. It was a simple life, but it was mine, fully and entirely. Financially, I was secure. I had worked hard for decades, investing wisely, saving diligently. My mortgage was paid off. My retirement accounts were healthy. I had planned my future like a project, with contingencies and backup plans. I knew where every dollar was and where it was going. No surprises, no chaos. My son Gregory and my daughter Melissa lived in the city, about a 30-minute drive from me. We spoke often enough: holiday calls, occasional Sunday brunches, updates about their busy lives. Gregory was a real estate broker, forever chasing the next big deal. Melissa was a marketing executive at a tech company, sleek and polished, and always on the move. I was proud of them, even if I sometimes missed the quieter versions of them from years ago, before ambition had polished away their rougher, kinder edges. Still, I never expected them to hover. I had raised them to be independent, strong, capable. I didn't want to be the kind of mother who clung too tightly or demanded visits out of guilt. I believed that love didn't need to be proven with frequency. It lived in the steady spaces between moments. Evenings were my favorite. I would make myself a small dinner: grilled chicken, a salad, maybe a glass of wine if the day had been particularly beautiful. Afterward, I would settle into my reading chair with a book, or sometimes lose myself in a puzzle at the dining room table. In those quiet hours, with only the ticking of the old grandfather clock and the occasional creak of the cooling house, I felt profoundly content. I wasn't lonely. I had friends: Marjorie from the book club, Paul from the community center, Anita who ran the farmer's market. We had lunches, movie nights, walks along the lake. I had built a small, steady circle around myself. People who understood that solitude wasn't something to be pitied, but something to be respected. My mind was still sharp. My hands were still steady. My plans for the coming years were simple: travel a little, take up painting again, maybe adopt a dog once I felt I had the right amount of patience for a creature who needed me more than my tomato plants did. Life was not glamorous, but it was rich in the ways that mattered to me. Predictable, peaceful, full of small, satisfying rituals that stitched each day together. I never thought that the foundation I had so carefully laid, the independence I had fought to maintain, would be the very thing that caused the first crack. It started subtly: little comments, slightly patronizing smiles, questions about whether I should really be handling all my financial matters alone. I brushed them off, chalking it up to the natural concerns of children watching their mother grow older. I thought they worried because they loved me. I didn't realize they had begun to think of my life and everything I had built within it as something they should manage. But in those first quiet months, before the shift became undeniable, I lived each day wrapped in the warm certainty that I was in control, and I cherished it. I held on to that peace as tightly as someone might hold on to the last light before a long, unexpected darkness. It was a Sunday afternoon when everything started to shift, though at the time it didn't seem like a shift at all. It was subtle, wrapped in the softness of family conversation, disguised as care. Gregory and Melissa had come over for lunch. I had made roast chicken with rosemary, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a peach cobbler for dessert. Cooking for them always brought back memories of when they were younger, when a homemade meal was enough to light up their faces. They arrived separately, busy as always, phones in hand, half their minds still in other conversations. Gregory kissed me on the cheek absent-mindedly, already talking about a new listing he was excited about. Melissa hugged me briefly, complimented the smell of the kitchen, and then immediately asked for the Wi-Fi password. I smiled, let it pass. It was just how they were now. We sat around the old oak table, the one that had witnessed decades of birthdays, arguments, laughter, and late-night confessions. They ate quickly, praised the food distractedly, and talked mostly to each other about the market, about new tech trends, about people I didn't know and would likely never meet. I listened, interjecting here and there when a gap opened, but mostly I let them carry the flow. After dessert, when the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured, Gregory leaned back in his chair and stretched, exchanging a glance with Melissa. It was subtle, but I noticed it. That shared look, that silent communication. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, though I couldn't yet say why. Melissa was the one who spoke first. She began carefully, layering her voice with a kind of bright, exaggerated cheerfulness that immediately put me on edge. She said they had been talking, just between the two of them, and they had a proposal. Nothing urgent, nothing to worry about, but something they thought would be smart to get ahead of. Gregory chimed in, using phrases like future planning and responsibility and taking a little off your plate. He said it with a smile, a rehearsed casualness, as if he were offering to carry in the groceries rather than suggesting what he was about to suggest. They wanted to help me manage my finances, not assist, not advise, manage. Melissa pulled out a folder she had brought in her oversized tote bag. A simple manila folder, but to me, it might as well have been a flashing red warning sign. Inside were neatly printed documents: powers of attorney, financial management agreements, plans for consolidating accounts, all prepared, all ready for my signature. They spoke quickly, layering reassurances over one another. It would be easier this way, more efficient. If anything ever happened to me, they would already have access. There would be no messy transitions, no complicated legal hurdles. They would take care of everything. It sounded so reasonable, so responsible. But beneath their words, I heard something else, something sharper, a note of impatience, a hunger not entirely masked by their professional tones. I smiled. I nodded. I asked questions. I thanked them for thinking of me. And inside, my heart went cold. They framed it as concern. They wrapped it in the language of love. But love doesn't start with control. Love doesn't draft contracts behind your back. Love doesn't assume incompetence simply because your hair has grayed and your hands have slowed. I didn't say no that day. I didn't rip the papers in half or raise my voice. I thanked them for their thoughtfulness and promised I would think about it. I hugged them when they left, standing in the doorway of the home I had bought and paid for with decades of my own labor. I watched them walk to their cars, laughing together, already pulling out their phones. I closed the door quietly behind me. I sat down at the kitchen table, my coffee long since gone cold, and stared at the folder. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a stranger in my own life. I thought about all the years I had spent teaching them to stand on their own 2 feet, the nights I stayed up worrying about college applications, the sacrifices I made so they could have every opportunity. I had never asked for anything back. Not gratitude, not repayment, certainly not control. And yet, here we were. The folder sat on the table like a coiled snake. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was inside. It wasn't protection. It was permission. Permission for them to dismantle my independence piece by piece under the guise of safeguarding it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the creaks and sighs of the house, the shifting of the old wood, the settling of the foundation. It felt alive around me, this place I had built, this life I had crafted so carefully. And for the first time, I realized how easily it could all be taken away, not by strangers, not by illness or accident, but by the very people I had trusted most. It wasn't fear that kept me awake. It was clarity, a cold, bright clarity that told me this wasn't about if I would act. It was about when. In the days that followed that strange Sunday lunch, the folder sat untouched on my kitchen counter. I didn't hide it away in a drawer, didn't toss it in the trash. I left it there, in plain sight, as a reminder. It sat like a question I didn't want to answer, a presence that changed the atmosphere of the house, made the walls feel closer, the air thicker. At first, I tried to dismiss the feeling. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Gregory and Melissa were just being responsible, trying to help, trying to do the right thing. Children worried about aging parents. I had seen it happen to friends. Maybe this was simply my turn to be fussed over. Maybe I should be grateful. But every time I passed that folder, a knot twisted tighter inside me. Small things began to catch my attention, things I wouldn't have thought twice about before. Gregory called more frequently now, but the conversations were oddly focused. He asked detailed questions about the house, what repairs I might need soon, whether I had ever considered downsizing. He brought up market values casually, sliding numbers into conversations where they didn't belong. He mentioned an investor he knew, someone who might be very interested if I ever wanted to sell. Melissa, for her part, started dropping hints about streamlining my assets. She suggested meeting with a financial planner she trusted implicitly, someone who specialized in elder transitions. She sent me links to articles about retirement mistakes and avoiding becoming a burden. Each conversation came wrapped in concern, but underneath I could feel it, the push, the gentle, insistent pressure to move decisions out of my hands and into theirs, I began to notice other things too. A week after that lunch, I caught Gregory walking through the house when he thought I wasn't looking. Not just through the main rooms, but into the office where I kept my files, my safe, my financial records. He didn't touch anything, at least not that I could see. But when I asked what he was doing, he smiled too quickly and said he was just admiring the old bookshelves. Melissa started asking about my health in a way she never had before. She brought up memory lapses, small, imagined slip ups. She questioned whether I had paid the electric bill on time, whether I was keeping track of my medication. I knew what she was doing. I knew the narrative she was trying to build. It wasn't about love. It was about creating a justification. They wanted guardianship, not in name, not in title, but in practice. They wanted the keys to my life, handed over without a fight, dressed up as an act of care. I tested them, just a little. One afternoon, I told Melissa I was thinking about donating a significant portion of my savings to a local shelter for women in need. Her smile froze for half a second too long before she nodded. Later that night, I overheard Gregory's voicemail on my answering machine, his voice tight and urgent, asking if we could talk seriously about my future decisions. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about what they might lose. That realization cracked something deep inside me, something that had been solid for years. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the arrogance, the assumption that I wouldn't notice, wouldn't question, wouldn't fight. I watched them more closely after that. At brunch the following weekend, I pretended to forget the name of my bank. Melissa leaned in eagerly, offering to help me organize everything so it would be easier for her to step in if anything happened. Gregory brought printed lists of real estate listings, smiling as he casually mentioned how much easier life would be for me in a condo. No yard work, no maintenance, no wasted space. Their plans were already in motion, and I was supposed to step aside and let it happen. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with the lights off, the house dark and still around me, I made a decision. I would not confront them outright. I would not argue or beg for understanding. I would not play the role of the grateful, aging mother who handed over her life like a fragile heirloom. I would find out exactly how deep their plans went, and then I would act, on my terms, in my time. The folder still sat on the counter, untouched, as I picked up the phone and began searching for a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, someone who specialized in elder financial protection, someone who had seen what I was seeing now, someone who knew that sometimes the greatest threats came not from strangers, but from the very people who once called you Mom, with innocent eyes and open hands. The following morning, I sat down with a notepad and a cup of coffee, listing out everything I needed to do. Years of organizing other people's finances had taught me one thing: no war is won without preparation. I wasn't naive enough to believe that good intentions would protect me. I needed a strategy. The first thing I did was contact an old acquaintance, Richard Ames, an attorney I had worked with during my years consulting for small businesses. He specialized in estate planning and elder law now. I trusted him not because he had a slick website or promised easy solutions, but because he had always spoken plainly, even when the truth was uncomfortable. When he answered my call, he recognized my voice immediately. I could hear the surprise and concern tucked into his greeting. I told him I needed a private consultation, urgently but discreetly. He agreed to meet me the next afternoon at his office, tucked behind a nondescript row of buildings downtown. I appreciated the simplicity, no fanfare, no grand lobbies with marble floors. Just a door, a nameplate, and a place where real work happened. Before I left for the meeting, I gathered my paperwork. bank statements, property deeds, investment portfolios, medical directives, all the documentation that formed the architecture of my life. I placed everything into a locked briefcase, feeling the reassuring weight of it in my hands. When I arrived at Richard's office, he welcomed me with a firm handshake and a cup of tea. I sat across from him, the briefcase between us like a shield, and told him everything. I laid out the folder Gregory and Melissa had given me. I detailed the conversations, the pressure, the subtle erosion of trust. I spoke clearly, without dramatics, sticking to the facts the way I always had when presenting a financial report. He listened carefully, nodding occasionally, taking notes in a thick leather-bound journal. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "You're right to be cautious," he said simply. "And you're smart to act now." He explained my legal rights, the protections available, the steps I could take to secure my autonomy before any serious damage was done. He advised me to revise my estate plan immediately, to create an irrevocable trust that would place my assets beyond easy reach. He recommended a durable power of attorney, one that named a trusted third party, not family, to act on my behalf if I became incapacitated. But most importantly, he suggested I hire a private investigator. At first, the idea felt extreme. Private investigators were for suspicious spouses and missing persons, not mothers dealing with overly ambitious children. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I needed information, real information, not guesses, not assumptions. Richard gave me a name, Elizabeth Cole. He assured me she was discreet, thorough, and trustworthy. I made the call that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the briefcase still at my feet. Elizabeth's voice was calm and professional. She didn't ask many questions over the phone. She simply said she could meet me the next morning at a small cafe on the other side of town. Neutral ground. I spent that night restlessly, turning over every memory, every interaction with Gregory and Melissa in my mind. Was there a moment I had missed? A sign that this had been building for longer than I realized? I thought about the way Gregory used to count coins from his piggy bank, how serious he had been even as a boy about getting every penny accounted for. I thought about Melissa organizing her birthday parties down to the last detail, insisting that every game and gift be exactly right. Ambition had always burned bright in them. I had encouraged it. I had wanted them to be strong, independent, capable. I had not expected that strength to turn against me. At dawn, I dressed carefully. Nothing flashy, just a simple sweater and slacks, sturdy shoes. I didn't want to attract attention. I left the house without telling anyone. No notes, no explanations. The cafe was half empty when I arrived. Elizabeth sat at a corner table, her laptop open, a small notebook beside her coffee cup. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and an expression that made it clear she missed nothing. I introduced myself. She nodded once and gestured for me to sit. We spoke in low tones. I laid out the situation, sparing no details. I showed her the folder, explained the sudden interest in my property and finances. I told her about the pressure, the quiet manipulations. She listened without judgment. When I finished, she closed her notebook. "I can find out what you need to know," she said. "Discreetly. I'll be invisible." I nodded. We agreed on terms, signed the necessary papers, and she promised to begin immediately. As I drove home, the late morning sun casting long shadows across the road, I felt a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was readiness. I had taken the first steps. I had moved out of the realm of fear and into action. Whatever happened next, I would meet it with my eyes open. Elizabeth moved quickly. Within a week, she had gathered more information than I had expected, more than I had dared to fear. She was methodical, professional, and as discreet as she had promised. Each day she would send me brief updates, coded and cautious, until we agreed to meet again in person. We chose another small cafe, far from my usual circles, where the faces were unfamiliar and the coffee was strong. She brought a thin folder with her this time, clipped neatly, everything organized and dated. She handed it to me without ceremony and sat back, giving me space to absorb the contents. I took my time reading it. There it was, in black and white. Gregory had been speaking with real estate agents about my house for months, long before the proposal he and Melissa had made, long before the folder appeared on my kitchen table. He had even allowed a few agents to tour the property, posing as potential buyers interested in the area. They had no idea he didn't own the house. His name wasn't on any deed. But he had given them just enough encouragement to keep them engaged, promising that the seller would soon be ready to negotiate. Melissa's involvement was just as calculating. She had met twice with a financial advisor recommended by one of her colleagues, someone who specialized in managing estates for seniors experiencing cognitive decline. She had provided information about my retirement accounts, my investments, my savings, details she should not have known unless she had been accessing my personal papers or perhaps even my mail. There were emails, texts, meetings. They had laid out a plan, meticulous and cold. First, convince me to sign over power of attorney. Then, transfer assets into controlled accounts. Finally, liquidate the property while claiming it was for my own good to avoid future complications. The worst part wasn't the scheme itself. It was the casualness of it all. The way they spoke about me in their messages, as if I were a burden already, an obstacle to be managed, an asset to be leveraged. Not a mother, not a person, just a figure on a balance sheet. I sat at the table, the folder open before me, my hands steady despite the tremor I could feel working its way up my spine. Elizabeth watched me closely but said nothing. There was nothing to say. The evidence was clear. No room for misunderstanding. No way to soften it with excuses. When I finally looked up, I thanked her. She offered a small nod, understanding the weight of the moment. I drove home in silence. The town blurred past my windows, the familiar streets suddenly unfamiliar. I thought about all the milestones I had celebrated with Gregory and Melissa, the scraped knees I had bandaged, the math homework I had stayed up late to help with, the birthdays where I had stretched a thin paycheck to make sure there were balloons, and cakes and presents just right. Had I raised them wrong? Had I given too much, asked too little? I didn't know. All I knew was that the children I had loved without limit were now adults who saw me not as a foundation, but as an opportunity. When I pulled into my driveway, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. I sat in the car for a long time, watching the light fade, feeling the slow collapse of old certainties inside me. Later that evening, I spread the documents out across my dining room table. I read every line again, every note Elizabeth had included, every record of conversations and transactions. I traced the timeline with my finger, seeing how carefully, how patiently they had built their plan, and I realized something important. They hadn't started this because they thought I was weak. They had started it because they believed I wouldn't fight back. They had mistaken my kindness for fragility, my trust for foolishness. They thought I would be grateful for their intervention, that I would hand over my life with a bowed head and trembling hands, relieved to be relieved of responsibility. They didn't understand that I had built this life piece by piece, hour by hour, decision by decision, that every dollar in my savings, every shingle on my roof, every breath of peace I enjoyed had been earned through work and sacrifice they had never seen. They didn't understand that when you build something yourself, you do not let it be taken. Not quietly, not ever. That night, I stayed up drafting a new plan with Richard. I amended my will, strengthened the trust, revised my medical directives, and issued new powers of attorney naming only neutral third parties. I tightened the fortress around my life, brick by brick, word by word. I thought about calling Gregory and Melissa. I thought about confronting them, laying the folder on the table, asking them to explain themselves. But I knew it would be useless. There would be tears, denials, accusations, maybe even apologies crafted more from panic than remorse. I didn't need their explanations. I didn't need their regret. I needed my life back, free from their grasp. As I finally turned off the lights and went upstairs to bed, the house creaked and settled around me, old wood sighing in the cool night air. It was still mine. It would remain mine, because now I knew the truth, and the truth demanded action. The morning after I read Elizabeth's final report, I woke up before dawn. The sky outside was still dark, the kind of heavy darkness that presses against the windows and makes the walls feel closer. I sat at the edge of my bed, feeling the coolness of the wooden floor under my bare feet, and let the weight of what I had learned settle fully into my chest. There would be no pretending that things could go back to the way they were. There would be no easy forgiveness. It was time to act. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple gray sweater and navy slacks, a pair of low, sturdy shoes. Nothing about me would give away the storm I carried inside. I brewed coffee in the kitchen, the aroma filling the quiet house, and sat at the table with my planner open before me. Every decision needed to be measured, deliberate. There would be no outbursts, no emotional confrontations, only precision. I made a list, written in small, neat handwriting. Every item on it was a boundary I was about to set. Every task was a reinforcement of the life I had fought so long to build. First, I called Richard. We went over the documents one more time. He assured me that the new trust was airtight, that the durable power of attorney named only my lawyer and the independent trustee. He reminded me that Gregory and Melissa had no legal claim to my finances, my property, or my health care decisions unless I willingly gave them that power, and I had not. Next, I contacted my bank. I requested new security measures on all my accounts, voice identification, secret codes, new online credentials that only I knew. I placed alerts for any unusual activity. I instructed the manager to deny any access requests without my explicit in-person authorization. No exceptions. Afterward, I called the title office and updated the deed to my house, ensuring it was held firmly within the irrevocable trust. It could no longer be sold, transferred, or leveraged without my direction through legal channels that bypassed my children entirely. I even changed the locks on my doors. Not because I truly believed Gregory or Melissa would break in, but because symbolism matters. This was my home, my sanctuary, and it needed to be protected as fiercely as my finances. By noon, everything was in motion. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes, feeling a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was simply the quiet relief of knowing I had done what was necessary. Of course, they would find out. It was inevitable. I thought carefully about how to inform them. A conversation in person was out of the question. Too emotional, too chaotic. I needed a medium that allowed me to control the information, to state my position without inviting argument or manipulation. I decided on letters. I wrote two identical letters, one addressed to Gregory, one to Melissa. I chose my words with the precision of a surgeon, cutting out any softness that might be mistaken for an opening. I thanked them for their concern regarding my future. I acknowledged their efforts to assist me. And then I clearly, unequivocally stated that I had made independent legal arrangements to manage my assets and health care without their involvement. I reminded them that I loved them, but that my affairs were no longer a family discussion. I didn't offer explanations. I didn't leave room for debate. I sealed the letters, drove to the post office, and mailed them certified with return receipt requested. I wanted confirmation that they had received my words, that they could not claim ignorance later. On the drive home, I rolled down the windows. The winter air was sharp, bracing. It filled my lungs, cleared my head. When I returned, the house greeted me like an old friend, familiar, enduring, still mine. I spent the rest of the afternoon tending the garden. The roses had already gone dormant, the lavender dry and brittle under my fingers. I trimmed the dead growth, cleared the beds, prepared the soil for the quiet months ahead. It felt right working with the earth, making ready for something new. I thought of Maggie, my late sister, and how she had taught me as a young woman that gardens are acts of faith. You plant seeds you may never see bloom. You prune branches trusting they will grow back stronger. Setting boundaries, I realized, was an act of faith, too. I wasn't doing it because I wanted to shut my children out of my life. I was doing it because I still believed deep down that love could survive honesty, that relationships built on control were not relationships worth having, that protecting my dignity was not an act of betrayal, but an act of self-respect. As the sun began to set, casting the yard in long golden shadows, I stood at the edge of the garden and looked back at the house, my life. No one would take it from me, not with lies, not with manipulation, not even with the language of love twisted into something sharp and dangerous. I had made my decision, and for the first time in a long time, I felt wholly, fiercely alive. The certified mail notifications arrived 2 days later, one after the other. Crisp white cards slipped into my mailbox. I held them in my hands for a long moment, standing under the pale winter sky, feeling the weight of what they represented. They had received my letters. They had read my words. The silence that followed was louder than any argument they could have started. I knew it wouldn't stay silent for long. The first knock came late in the afternoon. I was in the kitchen, finishing a pot of stew, when the sharp rap echoed through the quiet house. I wiped my hands on a towel, took a steadying breath, and walked to the front door. Gregory stood there. He looked smaller than I remembered, less the booming, confident man who had tried to charm and maneuver his way through life, and more a boy caught in something he didn't know how to undo. He wore a jacket too thin for the season, his hands shoved into the pockets, his mouth set in a tight line. I didn't invite him in. I didn't step outside. I simply opened the door enough for us to see each other. No more, no less. He didn't speak. Neither did I. For a long moment, we stood there, the weight of a lifetime balanced between us. His eyes darted to the side, toward the familiar living room, the pictures hanging on the walls, the warmth he had once called home. But he didn't move forward, and I didn't offer. He took out a folded piece of paper from his pocket, held it out awkwardly. I didn't reach for it. I waited. Finally, he dropped his hand to his side and crumpled the paper inside his fist. He opened his mouth, closed it again. His eyes, when they met mine, were filled with a strange mixture of anger, confusion, and something that might have once been guilt, but had long since curdled into resentment. I stayed silent. I wanted him to speak first, to try to bridge the gap if he could, but he said nothing. He only stood there, shifting his weight from foot to foot, looking like he didn't recognize me anymore. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he never had. After a few more strained heartbeats, Gregory gave a small, helpless shrug, turned, and walked away. I watched him cross the lawn to his car, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He didn't look back. The next evening, it was Melissa's turn. She didn't knock right away. She stood outside my front gate, staring at the house like it was a place she had once visited in a dream and was now seeing with sober eyes. I spotted her from the kitchen window, her figure still and uncertain against the dusk. I didn't rush out to greet her. I finished washing the dishes, dried my hands carefully, and then walked to the door. By the time I opened it, she had worked up the courage to step onto the porch. Melissa was always better at appearances than Gregory. She wore her best coat, her hair styled neatly, her makeup flawless despite the cold. But even she couldn't hide the tightness around her mouth, the faint tremor in her hand as she smoothed her scarf. She offered a tentative smile, a fragile, trembling thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. I held her gaze. She opened her mouth, and for a second, I thought she might try to argue, to plead, to explain everything away with those well-rehearsed words she used in her professional life. But then she must have seen something in my expression, the resolve, the finality, because she closed her mouth without speaking. She simply stood there, tears brightening her eyes, waiting for something I didn't intend to give. I didn't move. I didn't break the silence. Slowly, she nodded, as if acknowledging something unspoken between us, and turned back toward her car. I watched her leave. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I simply closed the door and turned the lock. Inside, the house was warm, filled with the soft scent of stew still simmering on the stove, the ticking of the old clock in the hallway, familiar sounds, solid things, my life, still standing. I sat by the window that night, wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping tea and watching the stars blink to life one by one. I thought about all the words that had gone unsaid, apologies that might never come, accusations that might still be hurled later, the spaces between love and disappointment where so many relationships quietly drown. There was pain, yes, but there was also a strange, fierce peace, a knowledge that I had not abandoned them. I had simply refused to abandon myself. The conversations we didn't have were louder than any shouting match could have been. In their silence, I heard all the things they hadn't thought I would notice, all the ways they had underestimated me. And in my silence, I answered, "You cannot own what you did not build. You cannot control what you do not respect. You cannot silence what you do not understand." They had tried to claim my life out of fear, out of greed, out of some broken place I couldn't fix for them. But my life was not theirs to take. It never had been. The days that followed moved differently, slower, quieter, as if the very air around me had settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm that answered to no one's expectations but my own. For the first time in years, I realized just how much noise I had allowed into my life without noticing. Noise disguised as obligation, as tradition, as family. Now there was only the sound of my own footsteps on the hardwood floor, the creak of the old porch swing in the afternoon breeze, the whisper of pages turning when I sat down with a book. It was not loneliness, it was space, and it was mine. I decided to reshape my days by new rules, my rules. First, I no longer answered calls unless I wanted to. I changed my number, gave it only to those I trusted implicitly. No more interruptions from people who viewed my life as something to manage or manipulate. If someone truly cared, they would find a way to reach me through patience and respect, not demands and guilt. Second, I chose my company carefully. I rekindled friendships with people I had once drifted away from, not because of anger, but because I had been too consumed with everyone else's needs. I met Marjorie for coffee every Thursday, spent long afternoons gardening with Anita, volunteered at the local library sorting books and reading to children. Each connection was a conscious choice, a mutual giving, not an obligation. Third, I reclaimed my home. I reorganized the living room, took down old photographs that brought more sadness than joy, and replaced them with paintings I loved. I filled the house with music, classical in the mornings, jazz in the evenings, and lit candles even when there was no one there to appreciate them but me. I cooked meals that took hours if I wanted to, or simply made a sandwich if that suited me better. Every small act was a declaration. This space, this life, belonged to me. I also traveled. Nothing extravagant. Small trips to places I had always meant to visit but never found the time for. A weekend by the coast, where I walked the shoreline until my legs ached and the salt air filled my lungs. A drive through the hill country when the wildflowers bloomed so brightly it felt like the earth itself was singing. I stayed at small inns, chatted with strangers, woke up when I pleased. I answered to no one. Financially, I kept everything airtight. I reviewed my accounts regularly, kept detailed notes, ensured my lawyer and trustee remained informed of any changes. I took pride in the fact that I was still the steward of my own future. No one else would ever again presume to decide for me. As for Gregory and Melissa, the silence remained. There were occasional gestures, holiday cards without personal notes, brief emails asking if I needed anything. I responded politely, neutrally, never inviting more. I didn't shut the door forever, but I made it clear that if they wanted to be part of my life, it would be on my terms. Terms built on respect, not entitlement. They never apologized directly. I didn't expect them to. I didn't need the words. True apologies are actions, not sentences. Maybe one day they would understand that. Maybe not. Either way, I had made peace with it. One evening, as I sat on the porch wrapped in a knitted shawl, watching the sun dip below the trees, I thought about how different the view seemed now. The same trees, the same horizon, but a different woman watching it all. I wasn't the version of myself they had tried to control. I wasn't the frightened, aging figure they thought they could quietly move around like a piece on a board. I was a woman who had survived betrayals deeper than they could understand, losses greater than they could imagine. I was someone who had rebuilt herself, brick by brick, breath by breath, after every storm. I lived by my own rules now. Rules that said kindness is not weakness, that saying no is an act of love for oneself, that peace is worth more than approval, and that the most sacred thing a person can protect is the life they fought to create. As the last light faded from the sky, I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the cool air on my face, the solid weight of my home behind me. I had chosen myself, and that choice, once terrifying, now felt like the most natural thing in the world.